Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you. This is a conversation as part of Beyond Universe, which is GitHub's Universe 2021. And it's a fireside chat, maintainers advancing inclusion in open source. As some of you may be familiar, GitHub has started a new diversity, equity, and inclusion open source community that's focused on advancing DEI in open source through access, community, equity, and data. And what we've come to learn is that inclusion really happens at that community level, and maintainers are usually the ones charged with driving that culture of inclusion within their communities. And so we wanted to start really understanding the stories, the opportunities, the challenges, the pain points of maintainers, what support that they need. So we've embarked on this maintainers listening tour, which is a series of interviews, focus groups, and an online forum. Go to www.allinopensource.org if you want to contribute to the forum. And we're hosting conversations like this. These are some amazing panelists that have joined me today. They have been working on decades of work and experience in understanding maintainers and how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source. And so I'd love for them to introduce themselves. First, we have Dr. Danae Ford Robinson. Danae?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting myself and all of us to this panel, Demetrius. So nice to meet you all. I'm Danae Ford Robinson, a senior researcher at Microsoft Research and an affiliate assistant faculty at the University of Washington. I work on online programming communities, how to make these places more inclusive for marginalized people, ranging from gender, culture, and now recently looking at race. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And next we have Lauren Maefeo.
All right, thank you, Demetrius. Hi, everyone. My name's Lauren Maefeo. I work in my day job as a service designer at Steampunk, which is a government contracting firm which does technical redesigns and solution building for federal government clients. I also work as an area editor for the Data and Policy Journal, which is an open access journal peer-reviewed with Cambridge University Press. And I've been contributing to various open source initiatives regularly for the past 3 years. I am a community correspondent for opensource.com. I have spoken at the Open Source Summit from the Linux Foundation for the last 4 years and served on the program committee for this year's North America conference. And last year, during the pandemic, my pandemic project was to write a chapter for the Open Source Way guidebook on how project maintainers can build inclusive communities that attract diverse open source users. And I collaborated very closely with that I collaborated with Karsten very closely on that project, which is how we met.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, we have Karsten Wade, who I have to say is responsible for pulling this all together. I'm moderating, but this was Karsten's idea to make some of these introductions. So Karsten.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing. Definitely, thanks for helping make this happen. This is these are my passions of people and freedom coming together around open sourcing DEI is just amazing to me. So I'm so excited to be here, and I definitely feel like the least qualified of the panelists, but certainly will do my part to lend what I can. My name is Karsten. My he, him, ella pronouns. I'm a community architect in Red Hat's open source program office. And my research and work is centered around the Open Source Way community of practice, which was originally formed around the guidebook of the same name in 2009. And writing that book began more than a decade of conversations with maintainers of all kinds, and just hundreds and hundreds of people representing many different aspects of free and open source culture just all around the globe. And so 10 years after the first guide was written in 2019, 10 years later, working through 2020, we decided it was time to do a revision or update the guide, and I've led a team of writers and editors that were organizationally and individually vastly more diverse than the original small group of us folks who wrote defined the 1.0 version. And we found that the advice and the guidelines and the practices just have evolved really greatly over time, especially around people opening up to entirely new ways of looking at and treating their fellow humans. So And in fact, two of the most popular chapters in the 2.0 version were the chapter on inclusion that Lauren wrote and mentioned, and then also Ashley Nicholson's chapter on community manager self-care. And these are two topics that 10 years ago I never even would have thought about writing about, and now they were just so obvious and needed to be there. So just thanks again.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And to our audience who's here joining us, thank you all so much. As we go through this conversation, there might be questions that come up for you or points that you need for us to clarify. There's a Q&A function here inside of the chat window. Please drop your questions there, and we'll have some time set aside at the end of this panel for our panelists to address those questions. So I believe in jumping right in with panelists. I'm going to go ahead. So maintainers and community leaders usually contribute to open source and then ascend to manager or community leader within a community, or they start their own. But to get there, they have to contribute first. So there's like so much common agreement that contributing to open source is a privilege. Let's talk about what some of those barriers to entry are for contributing, especially for those from underrepresented backgrounds. Lauren, what do you say is one barrier?
Well, I would say the biggest barrier I found when I did research for my chapter on the Open Source Way guidebook is that the reality is that not everybody, in fact, the vast majority of people in the world do not have the time to work for free. And you might think that and I think there's a mindset old school in open source that it's not work. It's, you're contributing to the community, and if you use free tools, you should give back. And of course, in principle, that is true, but it really doesn't tell the whole story, because the research on uncompensated care very clearly shows that especially women and women of color more specifically are much more likely to do unpaid work, especially as it pertains to care, whether it's care of children or parents or sometimes neighbors. And so many people whom I interviewed for the book who actively contribute to open source said that if not for working in open source in their day jobs, they would not have the spare time to contribute to open source for free. And I will say at DrupalCon North America in 2019, the founder got up in his keynote and he said, I used to have the mindset that anybody could contribute to Drupal if they only had the will. And I was wrong about that, because the reality is that not everybody does have the time to contribute equally, and because they have other responsibilities outside, and those are unequally distributed. And that statement always sticks out at me as a really positive acknowledgement. It also shows that literally open source leaders and creators can change. And I found that a really positive affirmation, because like I said, the reality is that not everybody has the time to spend hours on GitHub looking for PRs.
Awesome. I saw Karsten and Danae both shaking their heads in agreement. So based on your research, what would you add to what Lauren just shared? Karsten?
Well, I definitely agree in that. I mean, that 100% that's the reality. And one thing that to keep in mind as well is that we can't assume the demographics of who your community is, and what their lived experiences are, what's difficult for them. Even if it's someone who seems to look and act exactly like you, their backgrounds, they're outside of the domain that you're in might be completely different. And so you have to talk to your contributors directly, create safe containers or spaces for people to reveal what they want to reveal to you, so you can learn about these things and address individual barriers to entry. And when you focus on lowering the barriers to entry for the people who have the hardest time, then it's in any given context, and it just makes it easier for everybody else. It's the basic rule of accessibility. And also just be careful not to require people to self-expose, especially around things like neurodiversity and mental health that can be stigmatized, that are stigmatized, and allow people to be advocates and allies and speak for other people, and don't question motives too much if the information is good. You can correlate it together.
This is great. Danae?
Yes, I actually have two points, because Lauren and Karsten both had great perspective. To go to Lauren's point, I also want to highlight that there are other contribution pathways for the few marginalized people that do contribute. Sometimes their type of contributions aren't recognized. So there is this research project happening in 2020 with the Project Software Foundation. And some of my collaborators like Igor Steinmacher, Anita Samra, and my intern, who I'll talk a little bit later, Miriam Ghazani, was looking at the contribution pathways of women in leadership in these organizations. And a lot of their, in these interviews and in their survey responses, they were indicating that a lot of the work they were doing was kind of triaging community members, right? Not just triaging like bugs so they can be in issues, but a lot of work, the mentoring that they were doing was not recognized in the project. So think about the on-ramp challenge of trying to contribute or trying to be a valued member of the community. And then what you do, which is also visible to other members, is not highlighted, right? So thinking about what are our strategies for recognizing people? It's going to be something that also, if we think about how to do that, going back to Karsten's example, this targeting few, helping the many, which is again a basic principle in accessibility, we can figure out how to create more opportunities for more people. The second point I wanted to kind of briefly talk about is kind of this maintainer dashboard that I had. Miriam Ghazani was one of my interns this summer who I identified because of the amazing work she did previously. We were looking at how to empower maintainers to better help newcomers in these projects. So again, allowing them to better attract and retain newcomers, new contributors, but also the people who are emerging leaders as potential maintainers. Let's acknowledge them. Let's give them the badges. Like let's guide and empower people along their journey, no matter what stage they're at. So a lot of the work we found, or some of the findings from that study, were that maintainers found this dashboard, which is what we put it in, this maintainer dashboard, helpful for figuring out how to proactively empower other contributors. But it was really great, interesting to also note that there was a lot of nuanced interactions that we weren't able to easily identify until we interviewed maintainers, right? So there's a lot of learning that had to go on here. But I guess the broader point is connecting and communicating with the maintainers, empowering the maintainers to also connect with their community members, regardless of size, helping them get creative about strategies to kind of engage everyone is something that I think is really important for decreasing barriers to participation.
Yeah, I think what I just heard from all three of you all is, these principles of inclusion around connection, communication, recognition, empowerment. All of you were touching on those themes in some form or fashion. And Danae, what you were just talking about at the end with that maintainers dashboard is around this principle of partnership, right? Like creating it with them, not for them. That's a tagline that we often use around All In. So I like to stay there for a moment with partnership. Can you tell me a way that partnership can show up in open source communities in a way that could be tremendously helpful with DEI and open source?
Okay, this is a great question. I have to also caveat it by I am a trained academic, right? So coming from the academic background of how we do software engineering research, empirical research, sometimes people are just writing these things to get a paper out and get their grants funded. But I'm a firm believer that my science is for the people. So I'm really, at least with my role here at Microsoft Research, now that I'm kind of into this next stage, I want to figure out how we can better encourage partnerships with organizations, with the Project Software Foundation, with All In for open source, right? With the United Nations Digital Public Goods Alliance. Because once we get those perspectives of people who are engaged, like deeply engaged in these communities, with the people who are actually building tools, at least at scale, like at Microsoft, for example, we can figure out how to be more meaningful, more intentional with our actions, right? When we're building things and make sure that they actually work for people. And when we hear their perspectives, do something with it, right? I think that when we talk about partnerships, I'm really trying to lean into that and encourage other academics as well to do the same, because I mean, they have the skills, the communities know what's actually going on. Let's put them together and make something real.
So all three of you all know that I've been trying to figure this Twitter thing out. I'm so quoting that, Danae, my science is for the people, and I'll be sure to credit you on that. So Karsten, what about you? What is a way that partnership has shown up in a powerful way in open source communities to benefit everyone?
Well, there's one that I think that partnerships, I've seen it happen just a little bit, and it could really show up a lot more. It's something I think we all want to see a lot more of, and it's around the notion of group responsibility and versus personal responsibility. And I know I feel that all the time. I mean, I'm someone who will charge down a hillside to grab one aluminum can, or that's going to get washed out to save it. But that little bit of recycling is really not changing the whole system, right? And so within within some of the particular aspects that have been really tight within open source communities around things. What we talked about earlier, Danae talked about the sense of going into something alone versus having mentors or people helping you along the way. Whether it's in the old school, kind of the older way of open source was that you just sort of charged in and you had to go figure it out, versus a world where things should be well documented and there's mentoring happening and so on. And in particular, there's also the aspect of mental health and wellness. I guess really the best way to tell this is the story of what happened with the chapter that we had on that subject in the open source way. Was that it seemed pretty obvious that we wanted to address the mental health and wellness of community managers, many of whom are in that position of having to deal with a lot of difficult stuff or handle code of conduct violations, or hearing the most difficult parts of a community, or really seeing it, and how that self-care can happen. And so so Ashley wrote the chapter, and we got it, and before we released it, we wanted to have a subject matter expert do a review. And so we reached out to a psychologist with experience in counseling in activist communities. So people who are really under very difficult situations. And she let us know that what we had was good advice, and it was definitely not harmful to be putting out to the world, but it was missing this organizational aspect. And it was like that light bulb going off in my head where I hadn't connected. Like, I know what happens with organizations not supporting people and how it is, and they're always putting that on you. But we get raised so much to feel that sense of personal responsibility, like that's going to make the big difference. So I'd really like to see somebody come out willingness to go into these kind of messier conversations. But I think that we're finding that people are more willing to have these conversations now. There's more desire amongst people to talk about these topics and to address them with maintainers trying to advance inclusion within their communities. So there's things that we can do, like hosting group discussions, having outside facilitations of meetings to make sure that people's voices are heard and brought in, and slowing things down to accommodate all the ways that people learn and bring this together. There's just so many aspects that can come in that organizations could be providing into these communities that are really difficult to self-start, because by their nature, they shouldn't be self-started. They should be offered in.
Yeah, I love that offering in, and what I was hearing from you, Karsten, was this whole concept around collective responsibility, right? And I think that's very in line with the foundational principles of open source around collaboration, right? We collaborate on everything, but as you said, those conversations are becoming more and more frequent, but there's still a lot of people in open source that says, this is messy work, as you called it. Like, this is a place for us to code and contribute to technology and projects and all those things. We shouldn't be in that messy work, quote unquote. Lauren, what do you think about that? Should this be responsibility of a maintainer, their own personal responsibility to get themselves taken care of? Or should the community as a collective provide this type of support?
I actually see this as a DEI issue, because the more community members and the more diverse community members with the most diverse skill sets you can recruit, the more people you can bring into your project, the more support you have as a maintainer. And so there's this whole idea that a maintainer the whole project should not rest on a maintainer's shoulders. And so by specifically seeking diverse contributors to your project and then making them feel included in many ways, especially by valuing all contributions to the project, not just those specific to code, that ideally over time should alleviate a lot of the burden on maintainers' shoulders. And it's important to acknowledge that many maintainers don't set out to really be a maintainer or a community manager. They started an open source project they thought was cool, and in some cases it really took off, and that's great on one hand. But I do remember an open source maintainer stepping down last year who had started a really prominent project, and part of the reason he stepped down was because he said, I'm very grateful for what I've created in the community that supports this project, but I always wanted to code it was never my intention to be a community manager. And so he chose to step back, but he had a successor in mind. And so if you want to, to use a governance term, you can even think of inclusion as a form of succession planning, by identifying people in the community who can step up when you do feel like A, you need a break, or B, it might actually be time to step away from the project.
I love that, because that's something that's been coming up over and over again as part of Maintainers Listening Tour. Like, what happens when you have a maintainer that stays there for sometimes, decades, and what that could mean as far as inclusion and whether their voice has a little bit more power than others and all those things there. And so that's really touching on equity, right? Like, all of what you were just talking about is, can we create a lot more equity while we're working to advance diversity and inclusion? And those are separate things. So what are some of those things, Karsten, I'm looking at you right now, that can be done to provide more equity in open source?
Wow, yeah, this is a great topic. I mean, so many things came in my head as Lauren was talking, and then you were bringing some of it together. But I think one drumbeat that I want to come back around on is one that I think a lot of us have been talking about for a long time. And this is like my personal story was coming into the open source as a technical writer, and doing documentation, and having somebody come and say, oh, you look like you're doing something, you want to do, inviting me in to take leadership and all those right pieces, and really seeing that modeled, and finding a way to make that important, and as a way to make to come in and have a path into open source, because so much of the language still is. People used to say code is king, right? Which, I mean, we could just unpack that in 4 or 5 different ways and end up at the bottom of a pit, no matter how you do it. And it's a terrible concept, but it also speaks to the kind of the cult of personality that is that happens in many cultures around wanting to a little bit of hero worship and so forth. And so the people who seem to be able to magically transform things, and I think what it is that there's every aspect of a career is available within open source. And it's just that we have, the code is really obvious because it's visible and then you can see it. But when you actually get in a project, there's a lot more going on and many more paths towards success that you can find. So for example, there are a lot of skill sets that are needed in open source, and that someone could come in, join a community and learn and grow these valuable skills, which is helpful towards employment, for example. I mean, people talk about your code contributions as your resume, and there's this idea that now you can use the entirety of a project and all your activities in there as proof of the work that you're doing. So some of the typical ones that have come to mind, we've talked over technical writing or writing documentation. Other ones I know, marketing, communication skills. Those are maybe a little more obvious, or events and so forth, because there's a lot of events going on in open source. But other ones that we've written extensively about and have some resources for more on this are things like sales and business development, the graphic design and user experience, including doing user experience. What was it? The work that Danae was doing with watching people's eyes as they are. I'm sorry, blanking on what that term is. Anyway, that you can, we've done all those things at events where people will come in to the booth and you sit down and do this thing, and at an open source project, you are now contributing to this project by spending 5 minutes doing this user experience research with us. And just really, and it just sparking people, and they go, oh, I didn't know that was going to contribute. And just as a way in, organizational change and strategy. Anytime you're taking leadership in an open source project, let me tell you, you're dealing with organizational change and strategy. And it translates to the business world and to the academic world, to the nonprofit world. Data science and engineering are becoming really big ones now. People management, dealing with, helping work with people, leadership skills. And now we can add things like SRE, the site reliability engineering, cloud operations. I mean, the list just goes on. And the key is that, again, that your transparent open source resume can just follow you wherever you go. And the more we build out tools to do that, the more attractive and that it can be to the wider group of people, making it worth more time to, when you have the privilege to spend a few minutes in there, to be able to do something and get some skills out of it, as well as resume experience.
Yeah, no, Karsten, when you were talking, my ears just perked up, right? You were talking about, organizational change, strategy, data, the tools. That's the place where you embed equity, where you embed diversity and inclusion. It's across the entire business strategy or community strategy or the community architect, right? Or texture. And so a lot of people are still looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as a separate program, right? And that's just not going to cut it. It has to be embedded in every single thing that you do. And so I want to keep along those same lines of equity, because I know all of you have, studied extensively about this. And so, research has consistently shown that lack of representation from those that identify as Black, African American, from African descent is still as stagnant today as it was a decade or more ago. Danae, I'm directing this question at you, not because of your racial identity, because you've recently kicked off a major research initiative called Technologists for Black Lives. Can you tell us more about that and how this research will be impactful to address racial equity in open source, please?
Yes, so let me actually send this in the chat probably. So the broader vision here is a lot of the work I'm doing right now at MSR, Microsoft Research, is looking at the next generation of software developers. And part of that work is how people are using their technical skills to help a broader societal goal. The next generation of developers care about that stuff. Think about the Gen Zers doing all their TikTok dances for a cause, basically, right? But so what I'm trying to figure out here is how do we we're talking about supporting marginalized perspectives. What are the people already in the community doing, like to support these marginalized people? Specifically, what are marginalized people doing to support marginalized people? I've done a lot of work before about this homophily of who's mentoring who, like women may be mentoring other women, or trans people may be mentoring other trans people. Because there's this in-group support system that kind of implicitly happens, but we don't highlight it enough, right? We take a lot of the heroism, like who's going to come in and save us, and sometimes people are already doing the groundwork. So with this like Technologists for Black Lives project, we're looking at how Black and African American technologists, developers, open source maintainers, contributors are building, curating, developing, building projects to support the Black lived experience, right? So this is very specific work, similar to how I've done specific work that was centered around how are women supporting women. And I think it's important that we can learn a lot from how people within groups are supporting each other, so we can figure out what can we pass off to allies at a broader scale, right? How can allies better support what people on the ground are already doing, people who are experiencing these things. So this project is in partnership with Dr. Brittany Johnson, who's at George Mason University, Dr. Christina Harrington, who's now at CMU. We've had excited stakeholders like Dr. Safiya Noble, who's at UCLA. And right now we just started our interviews, but again, we're really trying to figure out how we can, what are projects people are building? How do we better amplify them? What is their plans of growth? Some people maybe just built a project specifically for their community in a small scale, right? But maybe ones are meant, maybe some of the creators had intentions for it to grow beyond them, beyond their community, beyond their state, even go nationally and even globally. So again, taking that information and knowledge so that we're not just taking it for a paper, but giving it back to them, right? So we're figuring out how they can grow or where they want to grow. So we as researchers, as community members, can also amplify that work, better support where they want to go. And again, this is really intentional because this is why I lean on the experts of like Dr. Christina Harrington, who's done a lot of work with participatory design, which is basically, building with the community members, working with designers. She's done a lot of work with designers, older adults, and learning from them so we can build systems that can help a broader range of people. So again, it's really to better understand the lives that they're experiencing. And for us as researchers and community organizers and architects, to better support what they want to grow and how they want to grow.
Yeah. And it's, what came to me when you were sharing all of that is that, how they're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a very open source way of doing it, right? A lot of open source projects and work in open source happens because people look out there in the world and the thing that they need solved, the thing that they want help with doesn't exist. And so they started with the whole goal of giving it to the community, or in this case, giving it to the allies for them to build upon their work, but they're getting it started. And so I love that work that you just talked about. And so we are really, really interested in seeing what comes out of the Black technologists research that you're started. So Lauren, like I said, equity is so important. I want to hear from each and every one of you. What is a meaningful way that you think that maintainers and community leaders can help make things more equitable for contributors, especially those from marginalized communities?
There are two things that really come to mind, and one of them, Demetrius, is something that I know you found to be true when you were doing your maintainers listening tour, which is the fact that it is no longer enough for your project to have a code of conduct for how folks should be treated within the community. That is an absolute bare minimum. And I did speak to people who they have roles like being engineers at Apple. And I had one engineer at Apple who told me when I interviewed her for my book chapter that she had chosen not to contribute to certain open source projects and communities due to the lack of a code of conduct. And so that is a bare minimum. But you also found in your maintainers listening tour that folks really need help to enforce the code of conduct, because anybody can put a statement out there, but if you aren't acting on it as a leadership at a leadership level, that can become very problematic. In some ways, it can become more problematic than not having a state code of conduct at all. So enforcing the code of conduct and specifically training folks to enforce it and what they should do in certain situations is extremely helpful. The other thing is to prioritize documentation, and that's important for a few reasons. One is that a Stack Overflow study from 2019 found that about 41% of the developers they surveyed had less than 5 years of experience. So that means that there are a lot of new folks coming into the technology space, even in development, but also with other skill sets. And in order to utilize those people around common goals, the maintainers have to lower barriers to entry, and clear, concise documentation is really the first step. And I interviewed a lead technical writer who has worked with open source for years, and he currently serves as one of the co-chairs for the Kubernetes documentation special interest group, SIG Docs. And Kubernetes was actually his first open source project, and it, as you know, became maybe the most prolific project in open source right now. And it grew so quickly that it allowed this person to own important aspects of the documentation as the Kubernetes project grew. And his responsibility was to revise it so that it was more user-friendly. And he really firmly believes that self-documentation is a form of gatekeeping and really a sign of an unhealthy project culture. So one thing that he does with the SIG Docs working group is a quarterly review where they manage the progress of their previous quarter's goals, and then they prioritize work for the upcoming quarter. And then in order to adopt a goal, a person needs a specific person willing to drive it. So that's one way that they keep their documentation team accountable. But it's also one way of how your project really can find leaders and promote them, so to speak, within the project if you are willing to do the work that sometimes nobody else wants to do. And so again, it really goes back to acknowledging and rewarding people who take on those leadership roles, and especially that's essential when it comes to documentation.
Yeah. You know, documentation. I said that I was going to like create a shirt that says it's all about the documentation. You're absolutely right on that piece of it, Lauren. So thank you for bringing that up. I want to ask this question. So over the course of the past, 4 months that we've been on this maintainers listening tour, every single conversation, there's a surprise, at least one, usually multiple ones, where we went in thinking one way and the research was telling us one way from past years. And then maintainers are sharing something that is like blowing our minds out the water. We're like, we hadn't even thought of that. This is such a complex and nuanced discussion, and everybody's experience is different depending on who they are, where they are, what background that they have. So I want to hear from you all in your research over the course of the past few years, or even your entire lifespan in technology. What are some of the surprises that you've encountered where you might have thought one way or went into your research with one way, but something switched up over there to you? So Lauren.
Oh, that's a good question. I would say something that surprised me was the how many people have left an open source community for having had a negative experience. And one of them is that, I mean, and there are many reasons why, you know, what constitutes a negative experience that could be very different. But you know, 1 in 5, I think the latest research before the maintainers research you're doing, Demetrius, I think prior to what you're currently doing, the last major GitHub survey was in 2017, and that research found that 21% of contributors had left a project due to a negative experience. And as I mentioned, negative experience can be a very different, but it does go to show that, I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's an old school sense of entitlement when it comes to expecting people to contribute to open source, and especially if they use the project. But the reality is, if people, I mean, people are again doing this work for free, and if they are not treated properly, with basic respect and rewarded for their contributions, they will and arguably should leave. And so that data point really hits home that 1 in 5 has left a project for having had a negative experience. I wouldn't be surprised if the actual number is far higher.
Absolutely, that makes sense to me. Danae, what are some of the surprises in your research over the years?
Yes, this is really a good question. I was thinking about it as I was listening to Lauren. I was like, okay, listen to Lauren, but also think about what she's going to say. I think for me, the biggest surprise has been the value of forming relationships with people and how important that has been. And this would go to like interactions on GitHub, to a lot of work I was doing before with Stack Overflow, where we saw, for example, like when new contributors got feedback from a mentor, they received 50% increase in score rather than people who did not engage in that mentorship program. And for me, it was surprising that how many people think the offline interactions we have, like, you know, you have affinity groups, the mentorship groups, all these things you have in offline scenarios. Sometimes people forget that they translate to online as well. And I think that's the most surprising thing. And that people forget that they're still people, right? And that bonds are important, relationships are important. Someone to help guide you and help you feel supported in a new community where you're new here, right? Think about your first job and you didn't know anyone. And how valuable it was to have a buddy to say, okay, either you're going through the same experience for the first time together, or someone who's maybe a near peer, as Anita Sarma says, where they a couple notches ahead of you, but they're able to, it's still recent for them, so they can give you guidance and support you. I think that's the biggest surprise for me, that how valuable that is and how many people forget that.
That's really, really good. Karsten, what about you? I see you were shaking your head and smiling. Yeah. Both Lauren and Danae were talking about what's the surprise that you've seen or surprises?
Well, it's almost a corollary to what Danae was saying about it being about people, in that I guess I'm maybe not as nerdy as anyone else, but I have my nerd qualities, and I've been and I think that even when I sit down, but still when I realize about it, like even when I sit down, I've been playing D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, for 40 years, and every time I sit down at a table, whether it's real or virtual, the whole reason to be there is the people who are around the table, right? It's not I can just go play a video game by myself if that's what I was looking for, was just entertainment. And so really the reason why people get together in open source communities is because of the communities, and the open source part is the method by which we're getting together. It could be any other reason we got together. And so I guess what I would boil this down to, that even though it's about technology that we're working on, we're coming together around technology all the time, every problem is actually a people problem. Whatever's happening in the community, which means at its core, it's not really a problem, because people aren't a problem. All dogs are good, people aren't a problem. So it just means that we need to come and look at these things from a different perspective and understand. I don't know. I mean, it's been a lot of things, but always the thing that surprised me was when whenever I would be talking to people about something, and they would come to that final conclusion that every time that they work through what was a problem with the technology, or a problem with the company, or a problem with another project, or a problem with a disk on a server, no matter what you did, it came around to some kind of people thing that needed to be taken care of. that disk failed because the person whose job it was to make sure it got taken care of wasn't being taken care of, and they were overwhelmed. And so you can keep working it back to find how to solve the problem with the people, and then all the rest of it comes forward.
Yeah, Karsten, if I could, I would reach to the screen and give you like this biggest, like consider this a virtual hug. Like that was something that I found when I got back into tech and started working in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space. You'd be in a room full of engineers talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they'd be so annoyed and like irate, and they, just grappling with it. And it hit me one day. They were approaching DEI work in the engineer's mentality. What problem are we trying to solve? And they could never land on that problem. So they were having a hard time with it. And so I started saying, and just started speaking up, hey, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it isn't a problem to be solved. Diversity isn't a problem. It's an opportunity. It's an asset. It's valuable for us. And so that's something that I love to say all the time. And so you were hitting on this. This is people work, it's human work, it's heart work, and it's messy. And so it's not something that there's a script that we can write quickly or some piece of code and then it's no longer a problem. So thank you so much for saying that. And I want to turn to the chat really quickly before I ask the final question. And Danae, I'm coming back to you because it's talking about relationships. And that was the thing that you said you were surprised about. But I want to hear from all of you a response to this. But Danae, I'll start with you. So the question from Stephanie, and thank you, Stephanie, for this question. So much of inclusion relies on relationships. How do you make it sustainable and translate what works with individuals to being inclusive of groups of people?
This is an amazing question. So this question makes me think a lot about the Stack Overflow mentorship program. I don't know how many years ago I did this, but I was partnering with Christina Lustig, who at the time was the Stack Overflow's first researcher, and a bunch of their community research team, the community and growth team, to figure out how to build a mentorship program that could be sustainable later on. But initially we did it so it did not scale because we wanted to learn all the messy things that we need to be mindful of later on. And one thing that came out of that study was, again, it was human mentors and human newcomers, right, engaged in the community. The initial interaction kind of started with a bot, Christina bot, basically. And they started off by saying, hey, thank you for your feedback, or thank you for interest in getting feedback on your question on Stack Overflow. A mentor will be with you shortly. And I think what really helps make this sustainable later on is the fact that, okay, letting people know that there is a community of people online available, interested in helping, because there's always going to be newcomers joining in, right? But knowing that there is a community of people who are already here and willing to help. I think that's the opportunity gap that we kind of have to work better on, and how to make this sustainable is that people want to talk to real people, right? But how do we connect them with those who are interested and available to give that help without burning them out? Because maintainer burnout is a whole different topic, which we can talk about for a very long time, right? So I think what we need to do in order to make sustainable is figuring out how to pair people who want help and who have the opportunity to give the help. Because they're there, sometimes they just don't know how to connect with one another. That was something we find in the Open Source for Social Good project too. So
awesome. Lauren, what do you say about, relationships? And if you're focusing on relationships with individuals, how did that translate into being inclusive of groups of people?
Yeah, I love how thoughtful and challenging this question is, because I really think it gets to the crux of the challenge of creating inclusive communities is you can have this amazing interaction with someone at an individual level, and then the question becomes, how do you get that to scale? So one piece of advice that is in the chapter that I wrote for the Open Source Way guidebook comes from Nuritzi Sanchez, who manages open source community work at GitLab. And one piece of advice that she had was to make sure that your project has a chat tool specifically for community interactions. And it matters less what that tool is. What's most important is to have a private space where members of the community can connect, and they can also contact you as a maintainer directly if they need to. And you can, if you're worried about burnout as a maintainer, you can have a chat tool available just for community conversations, and then have a separate one just for your personal life. And that way you can turn off notifications as needed, or you can just have like a mental separation due to the UX of that. And so giving members of the community a shared space, and specific channels where they can find each other and get help if needed. I mean, two examples that come to mind is, let's say you're using Slack as an example. You could create a Slack channel for like a channel for help. You could create a channel for mentorship, to help mentors find mentees and vice versa. And so creating spaces online beyond GitHub that are designated for interaction, I think can go a long way towards scaling.
Awesome. That's great. Karsten, I'm looking at you now. And the thing about it is you were talking earlier about personal versus group, right? Responsibility. So this is what this question is at the heart of, right? Like personal relationships being leveraged for more group inclusion. So what do you think about this question?
Well, what's interesting to me is I think that I'm just, especially hearing the answers so far, what clicked into my head is like, I want to talk for a moment about communities of practice. So rather than an individual thing, let me just take one step back. This was one of those things that my teammates found out about 10 or 12 years ago when doing a professor's open source software experience day. And we're describing how open source communities work. And somebody said, that sounds like a community of practice. And we discovered there's an entire academic discipline and a model that's being used in organizations, has been for decades. And I put it into chat a link to the coming chapter content we're going to put into the next release of the open source way on this, but basically there's the idea that people get together as communities because they like to get together, and we work on a practice because we want to get better at something. And when you do those things together and you formalize it, you create a model of a thing that people can see themselves involved in. They can see how when you do it kind of accurately, with not with just good intention, but with good practice, then you make it possible for people to see themselves participating when they come in. Just as an example, every group is going to have a core group of people who've been around for a while. They have a lot of inside stories, a lot of experiences. Many of them may be in leadership, and there's a lot of ways in which that group can operate in a community. And by making it clear that everybody's welcome to become a member of that group simply by virtue of getting involved and being around, that creates a very different dynamic than when it's a clique and people don't see how they can get in. And so the second model, you end up getting more and more people who look just like the people who are in the clique, because they say, okay, the only way I'm going to become part of the clique is by being just like everyone else. And you get this little circle that feeds on this, a snake that bites its own tail thing. But when you show everybody that it's possible to come in and you recognize the idea of what's called legitimate peripheral participation, and I think of this as like, somebody comes in and they want to start folding napkins or sweeping, then that's great. You help them, with you show them where the broom and the dustpan is, where you want the stuff to go, where the floor. You just help them along the process and empower them to get to do that thing and begin to become involved in the project. So there's all these pieces that are part of how a community practice works. And when I say basically it's an intentional thing to say, we're going to go from being just a group of people doing things together to being a community and actually trying a community practice or an open source project or whatever you want to call yourselves. But once you've done that, you've gone from the individual to becoming a collective. So now you can act as a group towards each other in positive ways, or also in negative ways, which is why you have to keep watching out all the time so that you're not, so that the group dynamic doesn't become a weapon against itself.
Yeah. So what I heard the collective threads between all of you all is the importance of communication, the importance of documentation. So, to go back to Karsten, if you want somebody to put the trash in the place where you want them to, you put it in your documentation. And I heard you all say the importance of tools that facilitate inclusive communication, and especially open source tools, right? And so I heard you all say that. So I hope, Stephanie, that answers your question. Like, it was just so many rich nuggets that came out of that. So we thank you for that really thoughtful question there. And so as we are, wrapping up here, I mean, I just want to thank you all. This has been a fantastic panel, but as my own part of personal privilege, I like to ask and end all panels that I moderate with this question. For everybody that's attending today, for everybody that's going to be listening to this recording, what's the one thing that you want those that have joined or will listen later to walk away with? So Karsten?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about that one too, because it does matter. So I think what I want to take a page out of my colleague and good friend Thomas Koosmanen's book, which is to focus on knowing why knowing why it matters. Your why. Why does it matter to you to be inclusive? Why does it matter to you to live in a diverse world? And why does it matter to be equitable? And being open about why you care about making room for all people at the table. And helping other people find their own why. And I guess basically just that in conversation after conversation with other white folks, it keeps coming up that once people really see and understand that's been caused by the harm that's been caused by systemic racism, that they can't unsee that, they can't unknow. So that awareness is really often seems to be brought about through a transparency, through people being willing to share, and people in the audience going, oh, that resonates with me, that you are telling a story that's like my story and my background, and you're that similarity. You take advantage of the similarity that you get with other people, and then it just helps you. Open source just becomes another lens by which when people can find and clarify that why matters for themselves, and then they can kind of daisy chain it on from there. So know why your why, I think it's the key.
Awesome. Lauren, what would you like the audience to walk away with?
I'm going to quote someone who is pretty close to me in open source, Nithya Ruff, who is the head of the open source program office at Comcast, and her contributions to open source are too long to list. And she said, when I interviewed her for my book, that the marker of a good project is not how complicated it is, but how easy it is to get involved. So if people take away nothing from this talk, nothing else, I hope that maintainers here internalize that and really take a look at the journey of how people get involved in their open source community, and then make it that much easier for people to get involved.
I'm just over here writing my next Twitter quote. That's all that I'm doing here. So Danae, tell me what you would like for the audience to walk away with.
Yeah, so I think my biggest one is listening and then acting. I think we had the listening tour, the maintain listening tour, and us as researchers do a lot of like, okay, tell me how you feel, tell me what your experience was. But I think it's not enough. We need to act. So what I mean by that is not just listening to community members who are maintainers, but members who are just starting out, people who are on the journey, those one-day flies who join the community and leave because they had some traumatic experience at the beginning. I want to charge us to gather insight from their project stakeholders, the people who are invested in their project, not just the people who we see on paper contributing. And then once we gather the information, do something with it. So sitting on your insight you receive in some situations also inadvertently hurts the community, right? Because they're like, you took this time to get this information from me, and then you did nothing with it, right? So we have a responsibility as researchers, leaders on this panel as well. And in order to make a difference, you have to also know when to act upon what you heard. So you can't listen forever. There's some feedback I've received, that was some great perspective that someone brought up at one point. And understanding, like, for example, if you receive some critical feedback about, hey, this isn't working for me, you need to do something better about it, for a maintainer or community member, receive that, take that as like, okay, I messed up or I need to fix something, but then do something with what you learned. So, because now you know better, right? So you got to do better at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. You all heard it from Danae. You heard it from Karsten. You heard it from Lauren. We've been talking, we've been listening, we've been researching, and now it's time to act. And I would like to invite all of you to act with us through All In as we open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you all so much today for these amazing panelists. Thank you all for listening in. Thank you all for that will be listening to the recording. There's been a ton of activity within the chat of sharing of resources from our panelists and from our participants. We will make sure that list of resources are available when the recording goes live. Again, I invite you to go to www.allinopensource.org to learn more about the community, join the community, and tell us about your experiences via the online form for the Maintainers Listening Tour. Thank you all so much. Until we see you again. Bye.